Well, here I am today on a bright, sunshiny, almost summer day, and I'm at the Correction Center for the Public Safety for Box Elder County. And you can see right here, I'm right in front of their building. And what I want to comment on today is an interesting problem and kind of a common reaction we have many times when we read this next section of the Sermon on the Mount. And the reaction we have is that it sounds kind of like the novel by George Orwell, 1984. Because if you remember in 1984, if you read it in high school, maybe you read it recently, in 1984 there's a group of police called the Think Police, the Think Pol, the Thought Police. And what they do is they're constantly on the lookout for people who not are committing crimes, but people who are thinking about committing crimes. And this creates an interesting problem, because how can you always be sure that if someone's thinking about a particular crime, that in fact they're going to commit the crime? So for us, we normally would say, well, look, if someone does something wrong, then arrest them. That's the proof that they're thinking about it, because they actually followed through. But how can you arrest someone before they do something wrong? How can you actually come and put them in jail? I mean, we're at the Correction Center here. How can you put them in jail if they haven't really done anything yet? How can you come to a concrete understanding about the fact that they're doing something wrong just in the premeditation process of it? So when George Orwell wrote that, he wrote about the clever techniques in which the organization that's running Oceana, the state at the time, does things to out what people are thinking before they actually do anything wrong. And that's where we get a little disturbed by the entire idea of what we see in Matthew 5 coming up next, which is, it seems as though we can be, quote, prosecuted in the kingdom of heaven for what we're thinking without actually ever doing anything. And that's really disturbing to a lot of us. Would you like to be put in jail back here for what you're thinking as opposed to what you're doing? And that's the issue we're going to come to today. And in fact, is it a liability in the kingdom of God that in fact we will be judged based on not our actions, but something hidden inside of us, up for our intentions? And that's what Jesus is getting at. That's going to be the core issue he's going to talk about when he talks about the issue that we have to have our righteousness exceed that of the Pharisees. So if you've ever been in jail before, and I've been in jails, well, not because I did anything wrong, but because I visited people in jail. I used to do jail ministry in Spokane and loved doing it. But it gives you a deep, at the bottom of your gut kind of disturbing reaction to what happens if I violate the law. It's heavy, and most of us have never experienced that. Well, Jesus is going to raise the limits today and say, you may be doing a pretty good job in terms of moderating your actions and not actually doing things wrong, but how's the issue of your heart? Is it like George Orwell's Think Pol, the Thought Police, or is it something much different? Is it something actually more right? So we'll look at that today, and of course you know the answer of that is yes, of course it's right. But in what sense is it right? Because our first impulse is that, man, if you judge me based on what I don't do, I'm a little disturbed by that. So here we are at the Correction Center. By the way, I'll just add this before we go inside to talk about this some more. I really support and admire what the public safety people do for us, including taking people off the streets that are a public danger. So that's a really great deal. I'm very, very grateful for what they do for us and for the order that they bring to our society. Jesus was as well, and so was Paul. So again, as we're standing outside the Correction Center, public safety building for the county, just want to say thanks for what you do. So now let's go inside and chat a little bit about this whole idea of thought police in the kingdom of heaven. Well, not really. Okay, thought police, 1984. Okay, that might be a little extreme in terms of going where we're going. But this week in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is going to give us some specific examples of how it is our performance has problems. Now, you know, lots of times when we talk about performance, when we talk in evangelical circles, even in New Testament circles, we get a little nervous because after all, it's all about grace and not our performance. And that's actually true. But Jesus is trying to get at a root issue when it comes down to those who claim to be God's children and whether they are or not. And that's the problem with performance. So it's really not so much giving us a list of what we need to do as it is just a wide open exploration into how far we are falling short. And yet still, God is interested in us being like him, being children of God. So that's where we're coming from on this. Remember, a couple weeks ago, we looked at the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes were sort of a statement of what a blessed life looks like, living in the midst of a conflicted world. And so like those who suffer great loss, those who mourn great loss, either someone dies or something like that, well, they're comforted. But how are they comforted? Well, in the midst of the circumstances of life, people will see you comforted from a strange, invisible source. Why is it that you're not as troubled and as smitten when you suffer that kind of a lifelong loss, the Job-like loss, or even just the loss of someone near you that you love? So there, in the midst of those situations, in the stress of those situations, we're blessed because God has already blessed us, and as a result, we do what he says we're supposed to do, that is to let our good works shine before men and glorify God. And so that's really what the Beatitudes are about, a transformed life in the midst of a chaotic world. And the blessing that we have already received shines a light and salt to who God is. So he says that's what we are. Our purpose is salt and light. Salt gives flavor to the situation where it's flavorless. Light where it gives understanding. Both of these about the nature and character of God. So we are to be salt and light. And a great example, a list of salt and light, is the Beatitudes, how we are salt and light based on the larger issues of God's character, God's nearness to us in the midst of all this stuff. But even when he talks about salt and light, he's talking about a problem for performance. And that's what we talked about last week. Remember, he said, what purpose does salt have if it's not salty anymore? See, there's a problem in terms of what it's supposed to do and what it's not doing. A light you put up on a stand, you don't put it under a basket. So he's really talking about the fact that something is coming up short when we're talking about the fact that our purpose is to be salt and to be light. And so what are those things? Last week we skipped ahead a little bit, and we talked about the bigger issues, about heart issues. And this is really the answer to the whole question about how it's fixed. But it shows us an interesting insight into God's interest in our performance right now. And our performance is really more of a heart-based issue rather than an actions-based issue. Well, like what? What are we talking about? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that's where we are today in terms of coming up as Jesus proceeds into, okay, you want to know what I'm talking about? We're talking about problems of performance. We're talking about specifics about how God's righteousness is more than just our external actions. Our righteousness has something to do with our demonstrated heart, our hearts that have been remade by God. And so God's righteousness that is displayed in our lives is more than just the external. It's more about a sacrificial, compassionate, loving heart. Okay, give us an example. Well, here we go. The examples today, two really stark examples about how we're coming up short and we may not even know that we're coming up short. And so he's gonna give us two specific things. One of them is hatred for one another. The other one is lust. So we're going to look at that. Now, to help us figure out what this is all about, I'm going to start with a story that you know really, really well in the New Testament, and we're going to use this as a way to explore the mechanisms of how this works. And you know this story really well. This is the story of Zacchaeus. Remember the tax collector Zacchaeus? We find it in Luke 19. Let me just read to you the beginning of it. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through, and behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. A chief tax collector and was rich. And he was seeking to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he couldn't because he was small in stature. So he ran on ahead, climbed up on a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way anyway. I'm going to stop right there for a second. You know this scene so well, I don't need to describe it too much. But if you don't know much about tax collectors were guys who grew up in the villages that they were tax collectors in. They weren't Roman imports. They were collecting taxes for Rome, but they were local guys. This was the brilliance that Rome did, was they would use guys who were well known in the community. And as a result, when it came to levying taxes, they already knew who had money and who did not have money. They already knew the guys who were doing well, who were trading well, making more money, growing crops, making more. They knew all of that kind of stuff. Plus they had face recognition. There's just no way a village could get by with not paying its proper due when they were being held accountable by someone who knew them so well. That was a tax collector. Now, as a motivation to sell out your neighbors and friends and family to Rome for money as consolation prize, and it's not really consolation prize, it's a matter of enterprise. It's enterprise. Rome promised the tax collectors that they could keep whatever they could get away with taking that was more than what was owed Rome. They could keep it. So many times they would tell their friends and their neighbors and their family that they owed such and such, but actually they owed less than that to Rome. And so they got to keep what was different. So this is a way in which the locals, these tax collectors, betrayed and turned on their own family, generations of families in their villages, in order to make a lot of cash. And as long as Rome was being kept happy, as long as Rome was getting their cut, no one cared. It's very much like an ancient mafia in a way. Pass along the cash, make sure the cash flow is going. Rome's happy, you're happy, and you can get away with whatever you can get away with. That's a tax collector. Very hated, on the lowest rung in terms of human trash in the social order at the time. Now, Zacchaeus wasn't just a tax collector. He was, as it says in Luke 19, it says he was a chief tax collector. So he had guys working for him who were collecting taxes as well. I mean, this guy was accomplished. And so Luke adds, just in case you missed it, and he was rich. He was rich. So it's natural that the villagers would hate this guy with a passion. Hate this guy with a passion, because he constantly took advantage of their successes in life. They hated that. They hated that. Often, because these guys were so hated, Rome also offered a side benefit. They said, if you're having problems with the locals, like that's your family and your friends, you may need some enforcement. I'll loan you a couple of soldiers. So often these guys were protected by soldiers in the public square, and as people would walk by, he would say, "Psst, psst, you come over here," and bring them over. And if they didn't comply with what the tax collector was saying, they had, the two muscles on both sides to help enforce it. So it wasn't a really happy situation. Very naturally, the villagers hated these guys. Hated these guys. And so this is the context of Zacchaeus and the villagers. And keep that in your mind for a second, because as you hold that in your mind, what I want you to do is, click something on my screen. What I want you to do is apply it to this first application on hatred. Okay, so we're going to go to the passage today where we start off. We're in Matthew chapter 5, verse 21. So Jesus gives us an example of where we're having problems with our performance. For instance, he says, "You've heard it said to those of old, 'You shall not murder,' and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who's angry with his brother will be liable to judgment, and whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, 'You fool,'" gosh, I'm getting messages on my phone, "whoever says 'you fool' will be liable to the hell of fire." Can I tap this off my, thank you, okay. Will be liable to the hell of fire. So did you catch all that stuff? You've heard it said that you shall not murder. Okay. In fact, interestingly enough, almost every culture in the world says murder is bad. Almost everyone. You shall not murder. But I say to you, he doesn't reverse this. He just takes it deeper. If you hate one another, you're liable to judgment. What? See, we're back to the thought police. How can you take someone to court for just hating somebody? I mean, you got to prove that I actually hate them. It's easier for me. That's what I was saying over at the correction center. It's easier to take someone and put them in jail because they murder someone, because you got real evidence. But what kind of evidence do you have that someone's hating? That's a harder thing to do. In fact, it's an interesting complication during our modern days. We have these things called hate crimes, and hate crimes are pretty well accepted as a legal notion, but they're very hard to substantiate. I mean, say a hate crime leads someone to murder. Well, it's easy to show that someone was murdered, but then you can actually increase the penalty if you can prove that it was done because of hate. Well, isn't every murder done because of hate? And of course, there's a non sequitur going on here. When we say hate, we really mean racial hate. So if you can show that it's racial or sexual or something like that kind of hate, then that's hate instead of just normal hate that caused you to murder somebody. So you see, I see the intent of the law with hate crimes, but now you're reaching into the mind of someone and you have to prove the fact that they actually did it out of a prejudice instead of because, well, I just didn't want them around anymore. Anyway, getting back to this, he says, here's your first example, is this hatred thing. And before we explore that a little bit too more, look what he couples with this, because this is fascinating. He says then in verse 23, so if you're offering your gift at the altar and there you remember that your brother has something against you, well, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge and the judge to the guard and you be put in prison. And truly I say to you, you'll never get out until you have paid the last penny. So why couple this together with murder is hatred and hatred is murder kind of passage? Well, this brings us back to Zacchaeus. In the passage with Zacchaeus, with the villagers and Zacchaeus, leave Jesus out of this just for a second. We'll get to him at the end. But the villagers and Zacchaeus, this first part of Matthew 5:21, who is Jesus talking about when he says, you've heard it said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you, if you're angry with his brother, you'll be liable for judgment. Who's he talking about right there? Is he talking about the very evil Zacchaeus who sold out his villager friends? Or is he talking about the villagers? He's talking about the villagers. Yeah, talking about the villagers. And of course, at this point, if you raise this point and you bring this up with the people looking at this, especially the villagers, you say, well, wait a second. The villagers have a very good reason to hate Zacchaeus because he's a tax collector. It doesn't matter. He may very well have given them all the motivations and reasons to hate him. But that doesn't change the fact that their hatred in response, Jesus is saying, is the same as murder. Now that's what's astonishing about this, because we would look at the situation with Zacchaeus and the villagers and say, who's at fault here? And you say, well, clearly Zacchaeus is. Zacchaeus is. He's taking advantage of his friends and his relatives and his neighbors. I mean, it's robbery. It's Zacchaeus that's at wrong here. Very clearly, he's the one that's wrong, and he is. But Jesus is making the point that the villagers are as well, if their response is hate. Now let's look. He actually has a graded escalation of their response, and it gets worse. There's three ways. He says, if you're angry, if you insult, and if you say you fool. Okay, the angry one, it's this wonderful Greek word, orgizo. There's two words in Greek for anger. One of them is this flaring up really fast. You can't control it. I'm hot. You know, it's the same word that's used for flame that takes flame in dried grass or something like that, or dried straw. It's such, poof, it just flashes. That's not this one. This one, orgizo, is more of a provoked anger. It's an anger that results, it's more like if someone pesters you all the time and it gets on your nerves until you go from simmering to hot to boiling, and then you lash out in anger. That's a developed anger. Well, this is a developed anger. It's a provoked anger. It's as a result of something that's been done. It's not fast rising in flashes. It's slow and develops. And a side issue about it is that it's around even after that. It's not only comes to a slow boil and it holds there, but then you nurture it and you hold on to it. You even brood over it for a long amount of time. It's a long-held anger usually about this action that happened. So he says, look, if you have this provoked anger about something that happened with your brother, well, you're liable for judgment too. You don't have to kill him. And why? Well, because in your heart of hearts, when you hate the person for what they have done to you, when the villagers hate Zacchaeus for arguably what he's done wrong with them, when they hate him, they would prefer that he didn't exist anymore in their hearts. Now, they would stop their actions before they did something really, silly, like murdering him. But in their heart of hearts, if they had their way, if they had opportunity and there was no repercussions to it, they would prefer that he didn't exist. And that's what hate is. It's really the heart's passion to annihilate somebody. Now, in civilized society, we don't give in to those passions because we realize that's wrong. But somehow we cut ourselves a lot of slack thinking that even though I don't have opportunity to take them out, my heart still wants it. My heart still has a growing and nurtured passion for their annihilation. And that's what hate is. I would prefer that my universe did not exist with you in it. It's murder in the heart to take them out. All you have to do is be angry. All you have to do is have this nurtured, provoked anger against that person, which many times can be long lasting. It can happen for generations sometimes from same. And then he notches it up one in the narrative. He says, not only do you have to be angry or gizo with someone that's developed provoked anger, but if you insult your brother, you'll be liable to the council. I mean, they'll drag you in front of the authorities and they'll really take you out because you insulted them. Well, this word, a lot of people know it in the New Testament. It's raka. And raka is really it's a label of very arrogant contempt. Very arrogant contempt. So although orgizo, the anger that he started off with, is really a provoked anger about what someone does, this is very much an arrogant contempt for their entire person. Like, for instance, when someone does something that you don't like, many times when you extend the argument about what they don't like, you'll say, well, you never do this, or you always do this. You extend that one action to saying you're always like that. Well, that extension from the one action to that's your entire nature, you always do this or you never do this, that's the next step we just took. That's the insult. That's the raka. It's an accusation against the whole person, which maybe this action reflects, but in your mind, that action reflects the entire person. So if you jump to the conclusion that this person is raka, that is, their entire being is this action and more of it, you're going to the council. And then he ratchets it up one more time. Not only what they've done in orgizo angriness, not only their whole being, who they are, you never do anything right, attacking their entire being in that sense. But then if you go and you say your actual motivations and your character are twisted, then you get to the third one. If you say you fool. And this word fool is this word moro, which is where we get the word moron from. This is really a slanderous label against someone's entire being. It's putting together their motivations with who they are and saying you are a weasel, you are a jerk, you're a cheater in everything you do. So you characterize them based on all those characteristics. So what you're doing at that point is you're making some bold claims, some bold steps about about the motivations of their heart, which you can't really know. You can surmise, you can guess at, but so that's what he's saying right here. It's been said that you shouldn't murder anybody, right? But what if your heart is constantly wishing for their annihilation? In graded levels, in terms of provoked anger, developed anger that you've held on to for a long time. And with Zacchaeus, I'm sure the villagers held on to a long-term anger against this guy. It wasn't just from one event. It's from an entire lifetime of what he did working for the Romans. A developed anger, or if you ratchet up to saying you're always like, this is what your entire person is. You're totally worthless. Raka, you're nothing. And then lastly, to impugn them for their motivations themselves, what their heart is always about. You're just a twisted weasel. Okay, so Jesus is saying those grades are what a heart that's committed to a passion of annihilation thinks all the time. And regardless of whether the fact that you got opportunity or not to really annihilate this person makes no difference whatsoever. Your heart is wishing for it. And so Jesus says, from that perspective, you've murdered the person. That seems really odd to us that would be such a big deal. I mean, again, when you come back to the case with Zacchaeus and the villagers, doesn't it make a difference that the villagers had real cause to hate the guy? I mean, he was really treating them poorly. I mean, it's really bad. So don't they have a reason to be angry? Well, they have been visited by injustice, no question. But you can't jump to the next section of your heart's desires, which is, and so then I will wish for and think about and fantasize about their annihilation. If you think about it, we sin against other people as well. Would you like to be in the position where when you do something wrong to someone else, they wish for your annihilation? Because that's what hatred is. And that's what Jesus is saying is totally wrong. Well, then the second half of this passage, it starts in verse 23, he flips the tables. He says, so if you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, well, then leave your gift there before the altar and go. And first be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly. Well, so in this second half of this section, who's he talking about? The villagers or Zacchaeus? Zacchaeus. He's talking about Zacchaeus. He's saying, look, if you really have done something wrong, if you really have provoked anger in somebody else, yes, their response, wishing and fantasizing over your annihilation, is wrong, but you contributed it to it based on your wrong as well. So he flips the table from talking about the offended ones to talking about the offender. And in this case, the offended ones are wishing for murder, for annihilation. The one who's doing the offending also has a responsibility. And here's what he says. Before you come to God, before you bring a gift to God of thankfulness to God about what God has done for you, you need to straighten out all your other affairs. Just because you're getting your affairs straight with God is one thing, and that's good. But if you've got something dangling with other people that you caused, you need to fix that. You need to fix that. It's one way in which those who are the offenders can help those, the offended, to keep them from falling into the abyss of the passion of fantasizing their annihilation. If you do good things to other people, they won't fantasize about your annihilation that much, which is what hate is. So that's what he's saying. You need to do it. That's just a practical thing to do. And later on, we'll come back to this passage and see that, in fact, that's exactly what Zacchaeus does, is he makes that kind of fix. Okay, let's switch to the second sense, and I'm going to take a quick break right here, and we're going to switch from what seems like the pretty innocuous sin of just hating someone. I mean, that's not a big deal. But Jesus is saying it's a big deal. I mean, it's a very big deal. You'll be going to judgment for that as much as anything else. When you think murder's the worst thing ever, well, guess what? Your heart passionately fantasizing over someone's annihilation is exactly the same thing. It's just wanting for an opportunity to carry it out. The second thing he goes to, which is still, again, it's kind of like a thought crime, is lust. So let's take a quick break, and then I'll come back, and we'll talk about that. Lust. Let's just read it first. You've heard that it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out, throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off, throw it away. It's better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. Is lust really that bad? In our current culture, I don't think it even is a blip on most people's radar anymore in terms of what lust is. I mean, what in a previous generation, now this is 45 years ago? Yeah, this is 1976. So when Jimmy Carter was running for president in 1976, 76 elections, he did an interview with Rolling Stone magazine, and not Rolling Stone, with Playboy magazine. He did an interview with Playboy magazine, of all magazines, and they asked him a question about sexual issues, and he responded in a way that just shook the world. In fact, this is ranked as one of the top 10 worst things a politician probably has ever said in their best interests. But he was being very honest. He said to the Playboy magazine interview, he says, well, I've looked on a lot of women with lust. I've committed adultery in my heart many times. Today that wouldn't even make the news. It wouldn't even make the news. But back in 1976, 45 years ago, that was a very big deal. And it was quoted all the time. But today it's a completely different thing. In fact, lust has been turned into a multi-billion-dollar industry in the porn industry. It's really quite astonishing. Not only is it's just not offensive to anyone anymore, it's just considered a normal part of life. And if you make billions of dollars at it, well, so much better. Because after all, who's getting hurt by it? And that's what our normal judgment is, and our messed up modern thinking is, it's a crime if someone gets hurt. But if no one gets hurt, how can you make an argument that it's a crime? And so here Jesus is coming in saying something that's very counter to our culture today. He's saying that if you lust after a woman, you're committing adultery. Now, we would probably still agree that adultery is a bad deal. It's a betrayal at a level that disgusts almost every culture. Everyone does it, but it's still, we're saying, it's just not a great deal. It's a breaking of faithfulness. It's a lack of trust. I mean, there's a lot of issues that go with it. So we understand why that's bad. But lust is just the desire to do it. It's not really the carry through with it. And here we come back to the linkage of what we just talked about in this first part of this section about hatred and murder. Hatred is the heart's passion to annihilate someone without being given the opportunity to do it. So it's pretty much the same thing as carrying through murder itself. Lust is not a passion to annihilate. Lust is a passion to exploit, is what it is. Is that bad? Well, when you put it that way, that sounds pretty bad. If someone is constantly dwelling on a passion and a fantasizing to exploit someone else and not really to engage with them in a way that it's good for them, that's to their best interest. Kenneth Wuest, who's a translator of New Testament Greek, he said lust is something that happens when someone wants to indulge their sexual passion based on what they see. It's a very one-way kind of thing. It's a taking procedure. It's not a giving procedure. It's disgusting in that sense. But it really is. It is a mind crime, is what we'd put it in 1984 terms. But it's actually more than just a mind crime. It's a heart crime. It's a way of demeaning someone into being an object. And worse than that, because what your heart's desire isn't necessarily to demean the person and to belittle the person. Your heart's desire is to make itself rich by taking from somebody else. It's not for their benefit. It's totally the opposite of love in that particular sense. So Jesus says, even though you may be successful in not following through with your passions to exploit someone else, because you're not committing adultery, still your heart is wishing for it. And that's what lust is. And that's a bad deal. Now, is it really serious? It's really serious. It's really serious, which to those who actually are involved in the porn industry today, they would be probably shocked to find out that what they're engaged in, Jesus says, will send you to hell. The porn industry is a fascinating thing because when I first started tracking it, this is about the time of the opening of the internet in the mid-90s. It very quickly grew economically to a point where it equaled all the revenues that were taken in by professional sports in the United States. Equaled it. And now that's staggering. I mean, think about the Super Bowl and the NFL, about the Major League Baseball leagues, about basketball, about hockey. I'm talking everything. Within a short span of years, pornography on the internet equaled all the revenue of all the professional sports in the United States. Well, I just thought I'd recheck that. The porn industry worldwide, the revenue is just under $100 billion worldwide. $100 billion. All of our major league professional sports in the United States, they pull in maybe 30 to 35 billion. So now the porn industry, fueled by the access of the internet, has 3 times the revenue. 3 times the revenue of U.S. professional sports. That's how much it's grown. Now, that's worldwide consumption, but the majority of that $100 billion comes back into the United States as a cottage industry that we export all around the world. And the people that are involved in that industry have no moral sense that this is right or wrong. This is just another thing we do. I saw some tweets that someone posted recently to show just how calloused we are to this now. Some tweets that people sent out on their feeds in praise of pornography and how they love it in their lives. And it's less complicated than real live lovers who can turn on you and betray you and all that kind of stuff. And oh boy, how I do love my porn. I mean, and for my generation and before, we're going, what? No. Well, I'm not just being prudish. I'm talking about the fact that this is the height of exploitation of people. And if you think though that no one is hurt with pornography, you don't know much about pornography. Not only do the viewers themselves hurt themselves in their ability to have fulfilling, intimate relationships with other people, and it's profound, and there's been more studies going on all the time, but the people who participate in the industry are killing themselves. I mean, it's a horribly exploitive thing. And for what? For the satisfaction, the one-way unilateral satisfaction for pleasure. It's totally exploitive. Now, when Jesus talks about the problems of this thought crime, who's hurt? Everybody's hurt. This thought crime, he really ramps it up right now, because he's saying, okay, so you're not committing adultery. Good for you. But if you're lusting, guess what? It is so bad that, hyperbolically speaking, if your right eye, that you're seeing with, that's starting the lust process, if your right eye offends you, then pluck it out. Because it's better for you to lose an eye than it is to be thrown into hell for eternity. And in case you missed that point, he goes to the next hyperbolic statement, and he says, and if your right hand causes you to sin, well, cut it off and throw it away, because it's better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. Wow, this sounds serious. Yeah, it's very serious. And if you step back for a moment, remember we talked last week that the heart of the law is about love. This is lust, well, adultery, but lust as well, is the anti of love. It's all about taking from somebody. It's not about giving to somebody. And love is all about investing in someone for their best, to be committed to their best. And this is all about taking as much as you can from them. And who cares what happens to them? Who cares? As long as I'm happy, as long as they make me happy, I don't care. This has set the standard for many early marriages as well. People get married because they think, well, I'm marrying them because they make me happy. And then in about a half a dozen years, they come back and they say, well, we're getting divorced. Why? Well, because they don't make me happy anymore. I've used up whatever it was in them that made me happy. Well, that's what pornography and this kind of hedonism does. It reduces all of our relationships exploitively into, I'll stay together as long as you do it for me, as long as I get something out of it. But as soon as I stop getting anything out of it, as long as I don't get what I was hoping for, we'll stop, because your value is only in what I can take from you. And that's why this is nasty. This is why God hates this tremendously, because he loves his creatures who are made in his image, and for you to treat them like something that you can use up and dry up and have no interest in their well-being is disgusting. I mean, it literally is right up there with having a passion for their annihilation. But what you do before you annihilate them is you basically take as much out of them for your benefit as you can, and then annihilation is just fine. It's really pretty disgusting. So here, maybe for what people at the time thought was a relatively innocuous thing, lusting. I mean, we're not committing adultery. Jesus says, you'll be thrown straight into hell. You might as well lose pieces of your body if you can sacrificially stop the onslaught of this lust in your life. Again, he's speaking hyperbolic, and he's not meaning to do this literally, but he's trying to highlight the fact and wake you up to the fact that these kinds of thought crimes, no, these kinds of heart crimes that are so unlike God, is why God will end up rejecting you, because you've committed your heart not to loving those whom he loves, but you've committed your heart to taking advantage of them and exploiting those he loves. That's pretty bad. We could have used a lot of examples in here about where this has happened in the Bible. Bathsheba comes to mind. If you want to read about that yourself, go to 2 Samuel 11 and 12, chapters 11 and 12. The sinful woman in the New Testament who comes to Jesus' feet at the Pharisees' dinner party, that's in Luke 7. It's another one where tell me that there are no victims in this, because she's one of those victims. We could talk about a lot of those things. But all Jesus is doing right here is trying to highlight the fact that even though you have not on the outward part of your life carried through with this, your heart is still passionate to exploit other people And it's well demonstrated in lust. It doesn't matter if you actually did the adultery or not. Your heart has committed the crime. And it's very much against God's nature. It's very much against God's love for the ones that he's created. And the same is true from what he started off with when he talks about this murder and hate thing. Your heart is actually dwelling on wishes and passions and fantasies for another person's annihilation. And why? Because of what they've taken from you, because of how they've hurt you. So here we have two cases where people are taking from each other. The first one, the annihilation, someone's taken from you, so in return, what you do is you plan their annihilation in your heart. Guilty. Number two, you plan on taking from people maximally to exploit them, and because your heart dwells on that, that's lust, crime of the heart, guilty again. So Jesus covers these two bases of things that for us and during Jesus' time, people would think, well, what's the big deal? Well, Jesus is trying to tell us, and he started this last time, is that the nature of your heart, that's the big deal. That's the big deal. And in fact, when it comes down to the problems of performance, what we normally do is we get a little bent out of shape because we say, well, look, if my performance isn't so bad, then how can it be so bad of what's going on with me? I mean, why are you condemning me for what my head does or what my heart does? Well, because that's fundamentally who you are. That's who you are. We fool ourselves into thinking that because we can control our actions, murder, adultery, that because we can control our actions, somehow we're innocent. But Jesus is saying right here, no, you're not innocent. If your heart is still planning for annihilation and your heart is still planning for exploitation, you're not innocent. And in fact, the salt and light that Jesus wants us to be in this place is the salt and light that comes from not fantasizing over people's annihilation and not fantasizing on how to exploit other people. In fact, it's totally the opposite. It's how to further their lives, how to invest in their lives, how to bring good into their lives, because that is the nature of God's heart. And if you're demonstrating that in the circumstance that you're in, then sure enough, you will be glorifying God. And that's what he's talking about when he talks about the fact that we're meant to do that. I'm looking for a note here and I can't quite find it. Oh, there it is. Lost my train of thought. Oh, so here's the deal. Although at first I looked at this and thought, this sounds like thought police. This sounds unfair. I mean, who can judge thought police? Well, we can't really, which is why even in 1984 it's a bad deal, because you just can't substantiate your suspicions about someone in that sense. But we all do share one common thread in all of this. We all agree with Jesus with this, not because it's a thought crime or it's a heart crime. We all agree on this one fact. When it comes to people doing what they do in our lives, even if it looks sort of good, we hate phonies. We hate, and what's a phony? A phony is someone who does stuff, and sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad, but they do stuff largely good, trying to convince you that they're good. But we know that deep down inside they're phonies. They're phonies. We want their hearts to be behind this as much as their actions. We want that to be the same. In fact, that's the word we use for integrity. When someone's actions and someone's heart is doing exactly the same thing. They're not phonies. They're actually sincere. Such a good guy. He did such a good thing to me. He did this and he did this and he did that. You know, his heart is so good, and that's exactly the way he is. He's just like that. Yeah. But we hate phonies. And all Jesus is saying right here is God hates phonies too. He wants you to be inside and outside, reflecting the character and nature of God, to actually have God's heart rebuilt inside of you, so in the circumstances you're in, you glorify who he is because it's inside of you. Not phonies, not trying to apply it from the outside, but goodness that God creates inside us that then works its way to the outside of our lives. You know, another way to look at this is that God not only agrees with us that he doesn't like phonies, but last week we talked about list orientation in our thinking. if you see life in a way that it's like a series of tests, a good friend brought this up just recently. If you see life your whole lifetime as a test to perform the law well, and those who satisfy the test, those who don't violate the law, those who don't murder and commit adultery, and all those kinds of people who pass that test end up going to a good place in the end. That thinking is totally wrong. That thinking is totally wrong. It's only right in the sense that the only people who make it to heaven are forgiven people. People who are forgiven, and then the goodness of Jesus' righteousness is imputed to them. So in a sense, when God looks at us at judgment, he doesn't see us, he sees the righteousness of Christ. So righteousness is still a standard. Not one jot or tittle is going to go away. That's the standard for what the nature of our hearts need to be in the kingdom of God. But God takes care of the problem of our shortcomings of our heart. But our heart is still the domain of our major problem of performance. It's our hearts. So no, life is not a sequence of tests to see if we satisfy all the tests of the lifetime and then suddenly get over bar. It's not it at all. In fact, and we mentioned this once before, and we'll keep saying this, life is not a series of tests to make us better. Life is an opportunity to display the heart of God as he places you in the places he brings you. To display the heart of God so that when you react in circumstances, you'll react in a way that's very uncharacteristic for the people around you and the culture around you. I mean, for instance, when it comes to porn, is your heart broken when you think about the lives that are crushed because of porn, because of that industry? Not only the users, but the people who manufacture it. Because it should, because it's taking what is an extraordinarily precious gift from God, this sexuality we have, and turning it into an enterprise, and in the process, tragically dulling our abilities to connect with one another in a way most precious and designed by God. It's a grotesque tragedy. Do you mourn over that? Do you mourn over that? Remember that beatitude? Because those who mourn will be comforted. Yeah, there is a time coming when God will fix this. And God does bring comfort to people who are tragically involved in this kind of stuff. But here's the point. This is an opportunity to display the heart of God. Remember, he said in Matthew 5:16, in the same way let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who's in heaven. Not so that you can be tested and get over the bar and go to heaven afterwards. No. Let your good works shine in such a way that they give glory to your Father in heaven. That means displaying the heart of God in your heart and eventually into your actions in a way that totally disrupts the state of things in this fallen, sinful world, that brings salt, that brings flavor and tastefulness to decrepit situations or flat and tasteless situations, and that brings light and understanding and a knowledge of hope of who the character of God is and his loving kindness toward us. Completely transforming situations. That's what we're all about. Now, before we finish, let's go back to the Zacchaeus story, because I didn't finish the story for you. And let's ask ourselves, was God glorified in what happens in the second half of this story, like I'm talking about? Was this a case of someone trying to achieve something to satisfy the tests of life and gain some kind of status? Or was in this situation with Zacchaeus salt? Was it salty? Was it salty? Did it bring light? Let's remind ourselves, the villagers hated Zacchaeus. Hated Zacchaeus. And for good reason. He was swindling them all the time. He was drawing the lifeblood of their productivity all the time. They hated him. And that's wrong for them to hate him. But then look what happens. We pick up the story again in Luke 19, verse 5. And when Jesus came to the place where Zacchaeus was up in a tree, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried, came down, and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, the villagers who hated him, when they saw it, they all grumbled. He's gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. Bad hearts. Hating hearts. Verse 8, and Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. And Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Light. Taste. Do you see it right there? Jesus is acting against the mainstream crowd. The mainstream crowd would only be satisfied if Jesus hated and condemned this man. They would have liked nothing more than for Jesus to proceed under that sycamore tree and point up in the air and say, "Woe unto you, tax collector, who abuses his family and friends, who profits off of the workings of all those around him, who rats on his friends to the Romans and uses force with Romans." I mean, he could have really, done a job on Zacchaeus right in front of everybody. So they're looking up at the tree, and probably everyone would have stood on their feet and cheered. Why? Because they hated the man. Because their hearts were committed to fantasizing about his annihilation. What does Jesus do that's totally opposite the culture? He loves him. He loves him. He gives him an opportunity to host him. He gives him an honor that anyone in that crowd would have jumped at being able to do. Now, Jesus saw something redeemable in this man who did so many bad things. And believe me, Jesus knew everything that this guy had done wrong. He wasn't clueless about that. And yet he honored him and loved him. He loved him. Salt, light. One final thing before we finish here. I always fantasized about the Zacchaeus thing and wondered what would happen if instead of Jesus stopping and talking to Zacchaeus, what would it have been like if the villagers themselves had been salt and light in the situation? And of course, this kind of speculation, it never happened. But can you imagine how different it would be, how salty it would be, how light-filled it would be if one of the, say, moms in the group that was there in the crowd saw Zacchaeus up in the tree, walked out ahead of Jesus and ahead of the crowds as he was coming through the area, and said, "Zacchaeus, why don't you come down? You could stand with me. I know everyone's blocking your way back over there, but come down, stand with me." And you know what? Not only that, since it looks like you're interested in this Jesus guy, why don't you come over to my house for dinner tonight? And let's talk about this Jesus guy. And we can share why it is we both find him fascinating, and why it is our hearts are filled with hope, and why it is there's something about his love for people he doesn't even know that transforms us. Why don't you come over and let's do that together? Salt, light. But that runs totally counter to the natural impulse to hate him because of the injustices that he's visited on them. Jesus says, let your good works shine so that basically you'll glorify your Father in heaven, because that kind of mercy is in the Beatitudes, right? That kind of compassion is in the Beatitudes. That kind of hunger and thirst for all good things, that's in the Beatitudes. So Jesus wants you to walk in a way that not only your actions are proper and good, but that they reflect in a very obvious way a transformed heart that's been transformed into the very nature of God's heart himself, who loves. So Jesus says, if you want to know what the most important commandment is, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, and your neighbor is yourself. And why? Because that's God's nature. And he wants your heart displayed in public in the circumstances of life so that you can explain to people, my heart is like this, but it wasn't always like this. My heart is like this because God's changed me, because I've fallen in love with the heart of God himself. And I've asked him to transform me out of what I was into what I am now, more like God's heart himself. And so now I don't find myself passionately fantasizing over other people's annihilation, at least not as much, except when I drive on the freeway. And I don't look to exploiting people in every circumstance, the worst of that example being lust. I don't. And when it does arise, I'm disgusted. And I ask God to complete the task that he started in me to fix that. But what I have fallen in love with is the loving kindness of God. And he's reshaping my heart as a result. They're not thought crimes like 1984. They're heart shortfalls. And God says, I don't want phonies in my kingdom. I want people who not only have transformed actions, but their hearts themselves are transformed. And don't you ever be satisfied with the fact that your heart can say one thing and your actions another. I don't want phonies. I want genuine people who understand the heart of God, who I've made my heart in them. So that's what we're talking about. Well, next week we'll come back to the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus continues his example list in areas that we think, oh, we're not in danger of any problems right here. But again, the standard is so high. Your heart has to be displaying the very attributes of God, and that's his job to replicate in you. And when he does that, he puts you in places where your good works can glorify God. Because your heart change, that's his handiwork. And we can tell people that. I'm merciful because he said, mercy on me. I forgive what people do to me because God's forgiven me. I love because he first loved me. So we'll see you next week, and perhaps in the building, we're not sure. Keep tuned, and we'll see what happens in terms of opening up the church and things like that. But stay tuned and watch the website, and we would love to see you here in person. So until then, God bless you, and be a light, be salt. Ask God in the circumstances you're at what that looks like and how it can happen, and ask him above all to change your heart and write his law on your heart. Okay? Love you. We'll see you next week, hopefully.